All these metabolic dysfunctions we put on obesity, when in fact we should put on skeletal muscle. It's a skeletal muscle issue at its core, not an obesity issue. When these myokines are released from skeletal muscle, they actually have an anti-inflammatory effect. So they counterbalance some of this systemic inflammation over time, and they interface with the immune system. Dietary protein is the most important macronutrient. It is essential. It is literally what we are made of. Carbohydrates we don't need, we can make it. Fat, what the essential fatty acid need is so little. But dietary protein is irreplaceable.
For somebody who has been struggling with weight loss and they've tried all the different diets, they've tried playing with different macronutrients and upping and lowering protein, carbs, and fat, and they've tried cutting calories, you name it, and they've just had no success, why would you want them to tune into resistance training and putting on muscle as something to break through that plateau?
Well, as we know, skeletal muscle is the organ of longevity, and there is simply nothing as effective than exercise. And specifically, when we're thinking about body recomposition, you have to think about resistance training. It is just essential because it pushes the body to adapt to stress, to really be able to utilize substrates, which when we think about a substrate, you should think about carbohydrates, fatty acids, and again, you have to utilize what you're eating. Just essential.
Well, let's get into the physiology. Say somebody is keeping their healthy diet as is for now, eliminating that variable, but they've decided to incorporate resistance training, put on muscle. What's happening physiology-wise with that increased muscle when it comes to the way the macronutrients interact with the tissue?
Yeah, I think it's a somewhat of a complex topic, right? Are you talking about muscle at rest? Are we talking about muscle post-exercise? Are we talking about muscle post-feeding? But in order to kind of frame it appropriately, let's start with what muscle does, especially when we think about a metabolic perspective. Skeletal muscle is the primary site for fatty acid oxidation. It is the primary site for glucose disposal, insulin-related glucose disposal. That's important. It's also a primary site for non-insulin related glucose disposal, meaning through physical activity, the body does not require insulin. I think that your listeners know all about insulin, but let's say that they didn't. Insulin is a hormone released from the pancreas. You must release insulin to move blood sugar out of the bloodstream into tissues. And we know that elevated levels of blood sugar over time, that's the definition of diabetes. It can be extremely damaging to kidneys, to vasculature, to limbs, everything, right? Diabetes is a disease that the consequences of that are really significant. So skeletal muscle, again, as this primary site for your metabolism. Now, what is also in skeletal muscle? Skeletal muscle is, again, the primary site for also mitochondria. When we think about aging, and quite simply, we think about energy. The less mitochondria you have, the less energy you're going to have. And you can actually directly influence mitochondria through the health of skeletal muscle. That becomes very important. The other aspects of skeletal muscle are through the contraction of the tissue. And that would be through, again, endurance training, resistance training, any kind of exercise releases myokines. And myokines would be considered a hormone released from skeletal muscle. The big ones are interleukin 6. That's probably the most famous, interleukin 15, and cathepsin B, irisin. I'm sure that people have kind of heard a little bit about this, but they influence the release of BDNF in the brain, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I think that that's important to understand, that contracting skeletal muscle, releasing these myokines actually also changes the way fuels and substrates are utilized. So it's not just through the exercise itself, which is what people typically think, but it is also through the influence of skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ.
So we do a strength training exercise. Myokines are released locally and then systemically through the bloodstream.
Yes.
They're going to travel. And you mentioned the BDNF factor. So they're going to actually go through the blood-brain barrier, enter the brain.
Well, actually, it increases BDNF within the brain,
Right.
not BDNF in the bloodstream.
Don't they travel through the bloodstream
No,
through the blood-brain barrier to the brain?
the majority of BDNF is actually released within the brain, and it's stimulated by cathepsin B, which is in the blood, and irisin, which is in the blood.
Okay, well, let's talk about where myokines interact with that. Take me
Yeah.
through the whole pathway to make sure I understand that.
Well, there's hundreds of different myokines. There are just hundreds and hundreds of different myokines. I think that there's going to be many that we don't even, there's going to be many that are yet to be discovered. Where I really think about the importance of exercise and from a myokine release, I think about three specific effects that different myokines have. Number one, the effect on the immune system. So interleukin 6 and interleukin 15, we think about cytokine storm or these interleukins released from macrophages as that relates to a cytokine and just chronic or acute infection in nature, right? Well, when these myokines are released from skeletal muscle, they actually have an anti-inflammatory effect. So they counterbalance some of this systemic inflammation over time, and they interface with the immune system. And that is pretty fascinating, this idea that exercise actually interfaces with the immune system. The other really fascinating part about it is that interleukin 6 from skeletal muscle acts differently in the body than interleukin 6 from the immune cells. One creates an inflammatory effect, the other one is somewhat anti-inflammatory. And it's incredible. So you're leveraging skeletal muscle to balance this immune system regulation. The other aspect about myokines really comes down to, in my mind, interleukin 6. And interleukin 6 actually affects the liver. It affects adipose tissue. And when you think about its effect on the liver, it is really impactful in the way in which it utilizes fat. So you can actually use more fat when you are releasing interleukin 6. And I'm saying this quite simply. It is somewhat of a complex process, but again, to simplify it, this idea that contracting skeletal muscle, it's not just about burning calories. It's not just about creating energy flux within the tissue, leveraging glycogen and then creating energy flux, but also the influence of interleukin 6 on lipolysis and things of that nature.
All right, to make sure I have this correctly, there's three different parts you broke down there. The BDNF,
Yeah.
the immune system impact,
Mm-hmm.
and the third one when it comes to myokines is the breakdown of fat in the liver.
Yes. And and interleukin 6 has, again, multiple roles, but in a low glycogen state, there's some evidence to suggest that potentially interleukin 6 may even have more of an impact.
All right, let's come back
That's
to
fascinating.
the BDNF part here, because I still am not totally clear on this. So say we do bicep curls, and we use that as our form of resistance training just for this example. Myokines are released. They go into the bloodstream. How do they get to the brain, and how do they cause that BDNF
They're
to be
released
released?
in the brain. So they
Got
exist
it.
and are
Okay.
released in the brain. Yeah.
All right, so the release in the brain, let's take that story even further. For people that aren't
Mm-hmm.
familiar with BDNF, why this is so important.
So BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it is thought to help with neurogenesis and really the regulation and the health of neurons and brain function. And, neurons relate to brain function. The other aspect of that, which I think is not totally talked about often, is this idea that the healthier your metabolism is, typically the healthier that your brain is. Again, I realize that I'm making a very linear statement, but I did my training in obesity medicine and geriatrics. And one of the things that we looked at was body composition and brain volume. We looked at older individuals, older I say, 50s, and those individuals that really had issues with obesity, definitely you saw that on their brain. And that's actually where the concept of muscle-centric medicine came from, was this interface between obesity and brain function. It was an aha moment.
So what you're
Moment
saying
of
here, to be
insight.
clear, somebody who is carrying extra body weight, their brain is going to be physically smaller.
There's a chance that it could be. There is a risk factor. Obesity is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. I mean, Alzheimer's could be thought of as type 3 diabetes of the brain.
Let's come back to myokines. So when we talked about them before, we talked about the liver aspect, the immune system, and the BDNF.
Yeah.
What about locally in the muscle?
I mean, locally in the muscle, again, there is possibility. Again, there's hundreds of different myokines, but it affects substrate utilization. Meaning, again, the way in which, quite just to simplify, how you have healthy skeletal muscle is really creating a flux. Unhealthy skeletal muscle is muscle that is untrained or sedentary, and what happens is it's almost like a suitcase. You open up the suitcase and you pack a bunch of carbohydrates in, and that carbohydrates, you could call that glycogen. After a period of time, when you open up the suitcase and you haven't unpacked it, you can't just keep packing more stuff in there. And ultimately, you get this infiltration of triglycerides and other ceramides, all kinds, diacylglycerol, all kinds of intermediates. But ultimately, it leads to intramuscular fat. And that really becomes a negative aspect on metabolism, energy, mitochondria, and just muscle health and tissue in general. Again, myokines, very complex, but the local influence of myokines will help with this substrate utilization and also potentially have lower levels of inflammation.
I like this suitcase analogy. So what you said there is that we can look at the muscle like a suitcase with glycogen being packed in, and we use resistance training to utilize that glycogen and make more room for glycogen to come back in the future. But where things become a problem and muscle tissue becomes unhealthy when we're not using that muscle and using up that glycogen, and we continue to have things like carbohydrates and starches, and you're going to elevate blood glucose, and glycogen's going to be full, and you're going to have nowhere really to put it.
And what is also really important to understand about this conversation is we always talk about obesity, and we think about obesity as something out there, and that's something that needs to be fixed, as if that is the source of the problem. Obesity is not the source of the problem. You see issues with insulin resistance in skeletal muscle decades before you see obesity and all the other diseases that ride along with it. Insulin resistance is a risk factor for diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease. All these metabolic dysfunctions we put on obesity, when in fact we should put on skeletal muscle. It's a skeletal muscle issue at its core, not an obesity issue. Again, obesity is a symptom of unhealthy skeletal muscle. The other component to that is these changes can begin so much earlier than we had thought, right? Again, I think with this resurgence of the conversation around cardiovascular disease, people used to think cardiovascular disease was kind of this disease later on in life, but we know that it begins much earlier. Plaque, hard, soft plaque begins much earlier. The same thing with skeletal muscle. The dysfunction in skeletal muscle also begins much earlier.
Let's come back to the insulin resistance piece and talk about specifically why maintaining healthy muscle is an important piece of this, because this is a subject that comes up time and time again on the show. And to give a really brief overview, this is when we're having carbohydrates, elevating our blood glucose, and then insulin is trying to drive that into the cells.
Right.
And over time, the body is going to compensate if their blood glucose remains high chronically, continue to make more insulin. And earlier you talked about some of the negative impacts of having high blood glucose, the toxicity on the body. There's also the increased insulin and the problems that causes as well.
Yeah.
So let's talk specifically about muscle and why. And we're there's some overlap here, but let's talk about addressing insulin resistance with resistance training and building muscle.
When you think about insulin resistance, you have to, in my mind, break it down to where are the sites, what tissues are affected by insulin. And the tissues, many tissues are affected by insulin, but what are the really insulin-sensitive tissues? Insulin-sensitive tissues, you think about skeletal muscle, you think about liver, you think about even potentially adipose tissue, right? And based on the size of the organ system. Skeletal muscle makes up 40% of your body's weight, right? This is the largest endocrine organ in the body, and it is directly sensitive and utilizes insulin, needs insulin to, again, move glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell. This is the only tissue that you have direct control over. That's it. You cannot think your liver to work harder. You cannot think anything else to work harder, but you can actively train skeletal muscle. And being the largest site for glucose disposal and an insulin-sensitive tissue at rest, then this is where you really have to target. So again, if you want to get into the specifics, there's a GLUT4 receptor that is an insulin-sensitive GLUT4 receptor that leverages insulin to move glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell. And when a exercising muscle is utilizing glucose, it does not require insulin. And this is the primary site for disposal. You have to have the data is clear that once you lose healthy skeletal muscle, you see increases in insulin resistance and increases in blood glucose.
Okay, to make sure I understand that correctly, because there's some nuance there. Skeletal muscle, you've mentioned this a couple times, does not require insulin to bring the glucose into the muscle.
Exercising. At rest, it does.
Yes, right. There's two parts to it.
Yeah.
So when we do resistance training, what I'm wanting clarification on here is it that we're clearing out the glycogen for the non-insulin glucose to come in, and we're putting on more muscle through resistance training, which is going to build more of a sink for even when we're using insulin to clear the blood glucose.
I really like the way that you're thinking about it. There's this huge argument that it's not really about muscle mass. It's all about strength. I would argue that I don't agree with that. I think it is a combination of strength, but I do think that the size and the mass really matters.
So this comes back to our suitcase. We're exercising a muscle. Again, we'll use the bicep. We're clearing out glycogen. So we're making room for glucose to come in from the bloodstream without insulin. Plus, over time, as we build up that volume of muscle, we're going to be able to use insulin because there's more volume to store. We can pull more glucose and regulate the blood glucose better long term.
Well, I would think that, number one, glucose is a fail-safe mechanism, not something that should be utilized all the time. I really, we think about insulin as something that is normal to utilize frequently, and I don't totally believe that we should be using it as much as we do, if that makes sense. It's a fail-safe mechanism. You don't want high levels of insulin. You don't want to create this, a robust response. You don't want to eat a bunch of glucose and have a robust response of insulin and then a subsequent drop in blood sugar, right? And then an increase in catecholamines. And then it's just like this ebb and flow of blood sugar, and it makes you tired and cranky. I think that that's a real negative. Where it becomes important is that if you eat carbohydrates, you have to have a place that is healthy, metabolically healthy to store it, and that would be skeletal muscle. Challenges happen as you age, or if you're on bed rest, or if you are really sedentary and you are losing skeletal muscle over time, then you become metabolically more unhealthy. And there's evidence to support that the loss of muscle mass is potentially even more detrimental than the gain of body fat.
So as you're talking about carbohydrates, I want to be clear, you're not anti-carb though. You
No.
clearly depict in the book, you're protein first when it comes to diet, then carbohydrates, and then fill in the blanks at the end with fats. And I think this is a good point to break down the diet piece and get into some of the specifics here, starting with protein and what you recommend to make it really easy for people. Take your body weight in pounds and aim for roughly that in grams of protein.
Yeah.
And then we'll take it from there and get into the other macros.
Here, so I'm going to tell you how about I tell you how I design my diet?
Please.
And this would be super easy for people. And again, I actually did a whole solo cast on this. I don't know, have you ever done a solo cast? I did my very first ever solo cast. And it was on this because that's what people really care about is how is it relevant for them? How do they design a diet for them. First thing that you have to think about is that there's no perfect way to do it. There is going to be some trial and error. We have to know where we're at to know where we're going. The first thing that I would recommend someone do, okay, is to actually track what they are eating for 2 weeks. Figure out exactly what you are doing and notice, are you weight stable? Has your weight remained the same? Figure out, okay, let's say you're at 2,000 calories and that's kind of where you are. So you understand where you're at right now and assuming that you are weight stable. The next thing that you have to think about is if you want to lose weight, and depending on how much weight you want to lose, there has to be a calorie deficit. That calorie deficit could be 30%, it could be 20%, slow and steady. The more weight you have to lose, the higher the calorie deficit. The less weight you have to lose, the lower the calorie deficit, because steady weight loss over time allows you to maintain lean tissue. Notice I didn't just say muscle. Lean tissue is organs, bone, it's everything, including skeletal muscle. Now, if you are wanting to put on muscle, then you would go into somewhat of a calorie surplus. And I think there's some controversy out there, but you do need calories. You do need food to put on skeletal muscle. And typically that would be anywhere from a 10 to 20% calorie surplus. Now, after you figure that out, I think the next question to ask yourself is, how much do you want to weigh? You have to know how much you weigh, and then you have to ask yourself, how much do you actually want to weigh? For me, I'm a small person. I'm about 110 pounds, believe it or not, 5'1", and I have about 120 grams of protein, just because I'm super physically active, and that's where I start. So a great place to start, and the literature would support 0.7 to 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, which is double what is recommended as the minimum to prevent deficiencies. We can all agree that the minimum to prevent deficiencies, which has not changed since 1968, is still 0.8 grams per kilogram. Again, a better range is to figure out where you want to weigh and shoot for that. And that would be, again, 0.7 to 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. The next thing that you have to think about is how you're going to distribute that protein. In a protein hierarchy, really, the most important is that 24-hour protein consumption. But I would argue that there may be some benefit to thinking about a plan of how you distribute to that. And that would really ultimately depend on your goal and how much protein you have to get in. In my book, I have a longevity track, and those are for people that really like where they're at and they just want to eat the correct macros to maintain their body composition over time. And what we do know is that the first meal of the day is the most studied, and especially from a muscle protein synthesis response, especially from a metabolic response. That first meal of the day is the meal that is easy to test, and it's the one where all the literature is really based off. To my knowledge, I haven't seen literature that looks at initiation factors and muscle protein synthesis very clearly at those second and subsequent meals, which I think is important to point out, because these recommendations, it's how do we make recommendations that benefit people over time? So that's a very long-winded way of saying the first meal of the day is very critical to get right. And whatever your protein need is, I still believe that first meal should be between a minimum of 30 grams of protein to upwards of 50 grams at that first meal.
We're going to get into the nuances. I want to pause you there because there's a lot to get into that you've already shared.
There's a lot I just said, I know.
I want to take it right back to the beginning when you talked about the first step for somebody is to go 2 weeks, journal what they are eating. And if they want to lose weight, they're going to need to get into a calorie deficit. I just want to push back on that point a little bit and say, what if this person is sedentary and they start including resistance training like we're talking about today, but keep the calories the same? Isn't there a good chance at that point they're going to start losing the weight without playing with the diet?
There's some really, really cool hallmark studies that I would say, you definitely will lose weight in a calorie deficit if you're just increasing resistance training. Again, depends on, I'm sure it would improve body composition, but to the extent that I don't really know. But yeah, I can't think of a study off the top of my head because all the studies that I really look at are either weight loss or obesity or a combination of resistance training and the synergistic effect of dietary protein. But yes, if someone were to eat the same way as they do and do resistance training, would you see some benefit? Yes, you certainly would.
And I'm not advocating for that. Obviously, we want to do all we can to
No, it's
get our
it's probably not the best
body
strategy.
composition in a good place, but it's just for looking at the science and the physiology. I'm picturing somebody who is carrying maybe 20 extra pounds of fat, and they have a typical type, office job. They come home and they
Mhm,
have dinner with their family, maybe watch some TV, barely moving their body, but then they go and continue everything like they're doing,
mhm.
but resistance train 3 days a week. My guess is 6 months down the road, they're going to have profound changes in how their body looks, and they're going to, burnt a lot of body fat from coming back to what we talked about before, putting on muscle and all the different benefits they're going to get.
Yeah, and I do wanna highlight that actually skeletal muscle at rest is not very, metabolically active or demanding. It is the reason skeletal muscle plays I believe it's about 30% of resting metabolic rate, which is not it's not huge. I mean, the brain is upwards of 20 something percent, and that's much smaller. So it's really, the mass, the size of skeletal muscle, but at rest, it's not incredibly active from just an energy demand standpoint. It's really the activity that is required to get the muscle, the activity, when you're also eating dietary protein at a threshold amount, it stimulates muscle tissue, which there's that thermic effect of feeding. But there's also this muscle protein synthetic response, which is um, a bit energy demanding. And those are some of the ways in which I think about skeletal muscle really pushes the lever. And these are really great questions, Jesse. So I appreciate it.
We're going to get to the breakfast and the muscle protein synthesis. But before we do, another piece on the calorie deficit. And whenever I hear those two words,
Hmm.
I think about shifting the basal metabolic rate. So if we start cutting
Yeah.
back calories, it seems like there's a group of people that push back against that right away. And I'm kind of on the fence here. I don't have the
Mm.
science to back this up. But if we start cutting back calories, say we do that over 6 months as a strategy to lose weight, won't the basal metabolic rate just come down and rebalance?
So what you're talking about is adaptive thermogenesis. Yes, a strategy of just cutting calories to lose weight is likely not an ideal strategy over the long haul. But dietary protein has been shown to have some counterbalance to this adaptive thermogenesis for some of the reasons that I had just mentioned.
Since we last talked, your mentor has been on the show, Dr. Don Layman, who
Oh,
you
good.
have your new book dedicated to.
I know. Isn't that the sweetest?
That
I
is.
just love him
Yeah,
so
he's
much.
incredible. And we got deep into this, but I think it's definitely worth repeating and getting your perspective on. And that's
Mhm.
where we were in the conversation before we jumped in and talked about this calorie deficit piece. So where I want to go is,
So if you ask him and I see sometimes a little bit different. If you were to ask him, he would say calorie deficit is definitely super important.
okay, well, let's move into the breakfast. I think you guys are pretty similar in this
Oh,
realm.
yeah.
You guys both recommend, I believe it's between 30 and 50 grams of
Yeah.
protein as a
Mhm.
bolus, as part of the
Mhm.
breakfast to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And leucine is part of that. That's part of the reason why we need to get to that threshold. But before we get into the nuances, talk about what muscle protein synthesis is. It's a very scientific sounding term. Are we just talking about
It's
building
actually pretty
muscle?
complex. No, it's
Okay,
actually
let's
not.
have you hash that out.
It's actually pretty complex. Don and I are going to do an entire podcast on this in the next few weeks. That is how complex the idea of thinking about this is. Muscle protein synthesis is what we use to measure the incorporation of amino acids into tissue, and this is believed to be over time. It is what you would think of as a biomarker. It is a physiological process that we can measure. It does not necessarily mean that muscle protein synthesis will generate from the amino acid alone the building of new muscle. I mean, we assume it will over time. We assume over time there's muscle accretion, but that again also takes a stimulus. It also takes a physiological adaptation through training. But the muscle protein synthetic response is a response of the tissue. And again, it's this incorporation into these amino acids into the tissue. But it doesn't, and it's necessary to prevent sarcopenia. Again, in my opinion, it's necessary to preserve and protect skeletal muscle. But does it mean that it will build skeletal muscle alone? No, and that's not why individuals necessarily look at muscle protein synthetic response. But is it necessary for that response to happen for the health of tissue? Yes.
All right, I think we still need to hash this out a little bit more because
it's actually pretty complicated.
Yeah, because I'm picturing amino acids coming in, and we're talking about building of tissue using those. So right away, my mind goes to building muscle. But you're saying that is part of building muscle, but not necessarily happening every time when we have muscle protein synthesis.
Not at all.
Okay.
So the 24-hour muscle protein synthetic response is probably the bigger picture. How much of a response did you get? Again, I think there's a lot of nuance, which is why we're going to do a whole show on this with Don. But one thing is for certain is we do need that response for the health of skeletal tissue. You do need that response. And we do know that response translates over to protecting lean tissue. Another thing to note is that to the degree of the response, you can't always measure it, right? So I think in order to really measure a change in tissue, it might have to be greater than 15%. So we use it. It's a generally accepted biomarker. Does it directly translate to muscle mass? No, it doesn't.
Got it. But there is some kind of building. It's an anabolic process.
It is an anabolic process. And that's a very good question.
Okay. So let's get into the nuances. Somebody has that bolus of protein whenever their first meal is. They can intermittent fast or not. Say it's 10 a.m., just again, giving an example here. And they have 40 grams, and we should be specific here, of animal protein, because there is a difference between animal and plant, and we can get into that in a little bit. Talk about what happens in the muscle. We'll call it MPS because it's a long term there. Talk about MPS when we take in that bolus and what's happening physiology-wise.
Yeah, well, the skeletal muscle is a nutrient-sensing organ, and that is part of what it does. It senses the quality of the diet, and it is exquisitely sensitive to leucine, one of the branched-chain amino acids. When there is a sufficient amount of leucine, then it stimulates mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, which then is a precursor for a lot of it's a protein complex, and there is a very large complex cascade that happens and ultimately results in a muscle protein synthesis. There's a few other things I think are important to point out. This muscle protein synthetic response could last for a few hours. Maybe it lasts for 2. But the other initiation factors like EIF4 and the other factors, again, if you were to look at this in a diagram, there is just a very complex system. Once you stimulate a mechanistic target of rapamycin, again, there are other initiation factors that have also been activated. And that is why the first meal is so important, because number one, it's really been studied and we know that it has value. We've seen that, there was this, I think it was Arnell, some of the earlier protein distribution papers looked at something called, it was in women called and protein pulsing. And what they did is they did they looked at somewhat of the distribution. They looked at 2 small meals of protein. So it was an average of 70 grams of protein in a day. They looked at 2 small meals and then 150 gram bolus meal. And they saw a greater retention in lean tissue over time. But yeah, so all of that is to say that this first meal is very important. And to my knowledge, there's no data regarding the physiological, the biochemical effect on that second meal. So are these initiation factors still elevated at that second meal? Maybe, again, I think it's important that we don't necessarily know, but then that's where the 24-hour protein ingestion comes into play, because that's also very important. But that first meal has been very well studied. In fact, all the data that I've seen.
You mentioned there being a bunch of different initiation factors, and we know the leucine threshold and getting that bolus of protein is part of this. But if we're having that 30 to 50 grams of protein, does that cover all the initiation factors?
Yeah, it does. It's really based on that stimulation of mTOR through leucine.
And
Great
when it comes
question.
to 30 to 50 grams, is it just about the leucine?
So I'm going to answer that question in 2 ways. It is about the leucine because as skeletal muscle changes over time, the physiology of the muscle changes. It is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. Again, I was just arguing with Don about this because I don't necessarily believe it does just naturally become more insulin resistant. And I'll tell you what he said. So I said, Don, it's not that it just becomes more insulin resistant. And he said, no, there are clear changes in skeletal muscle because an 80-year-old, even if they've lifted their whole life, they're not going to be as big as they were when they were in their 30s. And I was like, okay, so maybe there is this physiological process that happens. But anyway, so I digress. So skeletal muscle is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. It is thought to also become more anabolically resistant, meaning the efficiency to utilize dietary protein, specifically the efficiency to utilize leucine, becomes somewhat blunted.
Is that as we age or as we put on muscle mass?
Allegedly. No, it's allegedly as we age. Could also be with obesity, anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle. So anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle can affect the processes of that tissue, the efficiency. I think that's a better way to put it, the efficiency of that tissue. The 30 to 50 grams comes from that leucine threshold. If you're eating high quality protein, you're getting a minimum of 2.5 grams of leucine, which is necessary to stimulate that process of mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin. If you do not hit a threshold, you won't stimulate it. It is kind of I'm talking about it as an on and off switch, but there's low levels of mTOR activation that are going on all the time. But just from a muscle perspective, because there's mTOR in every cell in the body, but from a muscle perspective, this stimulation requires a particular amount of protein. When you're younger, you could get away with 1.8 grams of leucine. So when you're really young, I have 2 really little kids, 2 and 4, they don't need a protein distribution. They don't need a bolus of protein because they're growing. They're driven by hormones. They're in a growth phase. They don't require an anabolic stimulus from dietary protein. I think a better way of saying that is they don't require a leucine threshold, right? They could easily get away with 5 grams of dietary protein because, again, they're always growing, up until a certain age. I would say if I were to pick a number at around 30, when hormones potentially are changing, or maybe it's 32, or maybe it's 35, the efficiency of that muscle goes down. And in order to have muscle respond like younger muscle, so in order to have older muscle respond like younger muscle, you have to increase the dosing of that protein. And that's where potentially going up to the 40 to 50 gram really kind of maxes out the system. Yeah. And there's some really early work. I would say another hallmark study would be Katsanos did some of these earlier studies where he looked at, or his group looked at younger individuals in their 20s and then older individuals, 65, and found that the younger individuals will get a full robust response with 1.8 grams. And that when an older individual was given a 2.5, maybe it was 2.8 grams of leucine, that older tissue responded like younger tissue.
All right, there's some nuance here I want to make sure we clarify before we move forward. So, as a young child, we don't have to worry about the protein bolus. But when we get to about 30, that's when the 30 to 50 grams comes into play. And then if we take it beyond that, somebody around Don's age, I think he's in his mid-70s, it sounds like in that bracket, or somebody who's obese might need to even up that even more. Is that correct?
Well, it's safe to say that as we age, we need more protein. That is safe to say. Is there any evidence to suggest going above 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight? Not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to get a more of a muscle sparing effect. Again, there's a lot of things to consider. Perhaps if you're in a calorie deficit, yes, but if you're eating a normal diet that is not at maintenance, not in a calorie deficit at 1.6 grams per kg, do you need to go above, above that? Is there evidence to support that double that number would be more beneficial? I would say no. And I would say that the aging literature would say anywhere between 1.4, maybe 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kg.
All right, let's take a hypothetical situation here. Somebody
I love those.
decided to, they understand what we just said, but they're trying to hack it.
Okay.
And we
In what
get
way?
a
Why
leucine
are they trying to hack
supplement,
it? Oh,
and
no.
then we
Yeah.
mix that with, say, a green smoothie in the morning. How would the body react to that?
I don't think that that's a great solution, because when you think about amino acids, they all have their own ratios. And a branched chain amino acid ratio would be a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio of leucine, isoleucine, and valine. If you just give leucine, the mechanisms, you would deplete the others. It exists within a system. So you wouldn't, from that perspective, want to supplement a single amino acid. And also, if your goal is protecting skeletal muscle or potentially even putting it on, you need all the amino acids, essential and non-essential.
What about carbs and fat with that 30 to 50 grams? Do they matter though?
Great.
What if it's just protein by itself? Are those components in MPS?
Insulin can be a driver of muscle protein synthesis as well. Is it going to be as robust as some of the others? Not necessarily.
Like, would it be a limiting factor is what I'm getting at, if it was just protein and not carbohydrates and fat for MPS?
For muscle protein synthesis for the response, I would say that carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor. No.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Or fat. Yeah. So it's just protein. No. It's not like you have to have that protein within a certain ratio of other macronutrients for it to take place.
No. And when you think about muscle protein synthesis, the muscle protein synthetic response, it can be driven by increase in total calories or insulin, driven by leucine, driven by resistance training, driven by growth factors. But the primary driver in skeletal muscle of the mechanism that we're talking about is leucine. It would not be, carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor.
So you just mentioned quickly there the fact that exercise stimulates it as well. Say somebody was to do a fasted workout in the morning and they really pushed it with resistance training in the gym, haven't had any protein, no leucine going in. What happens with MPS?
I mean, that's another way to stimulate it. The muscle protein synthetic response is stimulated by resistance training.
But would it really go anywhere if there was no amino acids coming in through the diet to keep it going?
You would not build muscle if you did not have dietary protein. what is also important to recognize is there's a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein. And we have seen that in nearly every study. And there are some amazing studies that, for example, if an individual was eating close to a food guide pyramid, right? So you take two different groups. And this was out of some of the earlier work in Lehman's lab when they had started to really think about these things and understand that protein dosing mattered, and just the macronutrient distribution mattered. If you took two groups and you took one and you put them on the RDA for dietary protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram, and then kind of a food guide pyramid picture, 50% carbohydrates, and you still put them in a hypocaloric diet. So you put them in a hypocaloric diet and you compared it with the same total calories. So let's say it's 1,600 calories with a double the RDA dietary protein, 1.6 grams per kg. And what they found just at rest is those individuals who just cut calories lost, 35% of lean mass. Like the loss was 35% of lean mass. If you compared it to that individual group that had double the RDA, which is 1.6 grams, again, these are still isocaloric, with 2 days of very light resistance training, they lost roughly, it was something like 10%. So there is a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein for the protection of skeletal muscle.
Let's talk about it from an energy perspective. And we've touched on this, but to get into the nuance there, if somebody hits that threshold, you mentioned before MPS being something that is energy intensive.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is making sure that they have that first meal, getting that bolus of 30 to 50 grams, how does that change the way those calories are metabolized in the body?
This is a very important point. So do you read research a lot? Where do you come up with these questions?
Just reading your book, talking to you
Awesome.
and Dawn, and I'm
This
just
is an
really into it.
awesome question. This is a really, really intelligent and nuanced question. In the literature, you will see that the influence of this thermic effect of feeding is variable for dietary protein. Sometimes you might see it 10%, sometimes you might see it upwards of 20%, right? There's variation. And the question is, well, if it's just a macronutrient and you're feeding just this thing, which nobody eats just this one thing, why is it varying so much? Right? Why is there a variation if you were to take 100 grams of dietary protein and you think that the thermic effect of food of that would be 20%? So you're actually only getting a net caloric intake of 80 calories, right? Because this process is so expensive. But in the literature, it's a variation of the percentage. Could it be 15%? Could it be 10%? Sometimes it's 20. And the question becomes, well, why is it so variable? And I believe, and I could speak for Don because we've talked about this ad nauseum together, this is what we do, is that it's the amount of protein per meal that actually influences this thermogenic response, but the response is due to the machinery of muscle protein synthesis. Another way of saying that is, let's say you took a protein diet and instead of eating it in a appropriately nutrient distributed way, like we talked about, 30 to 50 grams, you decided to do 10 grams throughout the whole day, right? You're 10 grams here, 10 grams there, 10 grams there. I suspect you would see a change in thermogenesis, that you would actually be utilizing less energy.
Because you're not activating MPS.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the whole other wing of this is the fact that protein is more satiating.
It's more satiating. It's much more difficult to store. It also, we talk about protein, but protein is actually 20 different amino acids, all with unique biological roles. And each amino acid has at least 2 different roles in the body. You think about threonine for mucin production. You think about tryptophan for serotonin, leucine for mTOR, arginine for nitric oxide. So it's not just, we talk about it in a generic term, but it's essential for a multitude of reasons.
And I want to highlight what we just got into. This is something I wanted to make sure we dove into. Up until this point, other than leucine, which we've talked about for the MPS threshold, we've been talking about protein as a whole in general. And yeah, when we're talking about 30 to 50 grams as that initial bolus, there can be such a diverse array of amino acids within that, because that's a good amount of protein. So if somebody's getting that from quinoa versus having a steak, it's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, even if they're having enough calories of quinoa to get the same amount bolus of protein in grams. So, and again, why I'm bringing this up, I want to highlight what you just said there. The fact that for whatever reason, when we talk about protein, we tend to umbrella it under protein as this term. And I know this is one of your core things you like to get into, the fact that we need to break it down because there's a lot more nuance in there.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the future of protein research is going to go, is that each amino acid is thought of as an individual nutrient. And that is where, once we begin to understand that, we will see that these foods are not interchangeable, and that high quality proteins are really, really important. And when you eat high quality proteins and you target skeletal muscle health, everything else falls into place. Right? So these essential amino acids like leucine, lysine, methionine, they're all not equally essential, right? And to say that in a different way, we have a day requirement for leucine. And that would be somewhat of a meal requirement. Whereas lysine, that is really important for carnitine synthesis, that might have a much slower pool turnover, right? Like that pool of lysine turns over much slower. This becomes very impractical for the individual to think about it. It just becomes very complex. Like, am I eating enough lysine? Is this enough methionine? Did I get enough threonine for my mucin production? Because 75% of threonine is utilized for mucin production. Very difficult. But if you understand the complexities of these amino acids, then the lay person will say, okay, I need to hit a high quality amino acid or a high quality food because I recognize that the amino acid profile in plant sources are different than the amino acid profile in animal sources. And it's just not about the total protein number. And that, I believe, is going to be the future, where we are looking at methionine, we are looking at lysine, we are looking at leucine, because those three seem to be the most limiting. And I propose that that's probably where we're going to go at some point.
Well, the way I see it as you're explaining this, 1.0 would be getting to that 30 to 50 grams within that bolus.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2.0 for somebody who's been there and wants to take it even further would be to make sure that's a certain quality of protein providing the array of amino acids. So for that person who's at that level and they want to make sure they're doing that correctly, you mentioned plant versus animal. Is it just getting your protein through an animal source? Is that going to provide enough of an array?
Yeah, it will. And again, you read the book. I'm not anti-plant. I'm not anti-animal. I'm a physician by training with years of nutritional science experience and training. And the perspective is we have to understand that foods are not interchangeable, and probably the best of both worlds, a diet would include both plants and animal proteins. And it's also, I want to highlight another layer to what we're speaking about. It's not just about the protein. It's not just about the amino acids. It's also about the things that ride along within the food matrix. For example, carnitine, taurine, creatine, all of which are in high amounts in animal-based foods. And, plants have phytonutrients and other vitamins and minerals. But again, we have to think about food as a food matrix. And if you are to eliminate one entire food group, this becomes a major challenge. For example, carnitine. I did this calculation, and I can't speak to the bioavailability of this, but carnitine is important for many things within the body. It's important, for aging, just a whole bunch of things. And it's primarily found in animal foods. And could you find it in some plant food? And I saw that I looked at this calculation, and you would have to eat 8 to 11 avocados to equal one serving to get the needed amount of carnitine in a day. Is the carnitine deficiency in the immediate going to pose a problem? Probably not. But over a lifetime of pretty significant restriction might create an issue.
Okay. Given what you just said, and there's this great graphic in the book where you show a piece of meat and it has all the different nutrients. I think there's about 8 of them around it that are only found in meat, or at least significantly. But what I'm getting at here is, for the person, for whatever reason, we don't have to get into the nuances of this, whether it be religion or ethics or whatever it is, they're not going to include meat in the diet. How would you guide them, given what we've talked about so far when it comes to protein and amino acids and these other nutrients? Have you seen a way to be complete, even if it does require a little bit more nuance to how everything's laid out?
Well, a person could be, you mean to be plant-based and be able to get their needs met?
Yeah, there's 2 different layers, though. The piece of meat, again, in your book with the 8 different nutrients that are, and you talked about the avocados.
Can you get that from plants?
Can we get enough of those nutrients plus enough of the right amino acids to get MPS stimulated on a plant-based diet? Have you found any nuance to helping people? Because no matter what we say, there's going to be a group of people, and it's become very significant within the health and wellness space, that aren't going to adopt animal-based protein for whatever reason.
Right.
So how do we help them optimize their health, or at least do the best they can given what they're going to eat?
Yeah, and that would be, you can definitely get enough protein on a plant-based diet, for sure. Would you keep in mind that the RDA and the discussions of increasing dietary protein are not based on plant-based proteins. So it is based on high-quality proteins. So the RDA at 0.8 grams as a minimum to prevent deficiencies. That's probably not the same for a plant-based individual. It's probably higher for the minimum to prevent deficiencies. So yes, someone could, an easy way to do it would be to add shakes. A rice pea blend, soy or tempeh, any of those other things. You definitely could get enough protein. I would also recommend supplementing with creatine, and definitely iron, calcium.
Okay. But there is still a number of nutrients in the book, again, around that piece of meat that people that are vegan aren't getting. So is there anything they can do other than look those up and supplement with them?
I think that they would probably have to supplement.
And the other piece to this too, Don and I got into it, the fact that when it comes to plant-based protein, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, and I want you to clarify this, is it true that we're not absorbing exactly what the label says when it comes to plant-based? We actually need more of it?
Yeah, so these are issues with how they do protein scoring, like this DIAS and PDCAS, which is, it's not super relevant for the listener. But the protein in the back of the label, with plant proteins, it could be, the labels are a bit misleading. It could be nitrogen, could be urea. It's not exactly the same as it would be from an animal-based source. It's typically lower.
And you mentioned when it comes to the plant-based diet, I think you said pea protein, but let's come back to animal-based and say it's a whey protein. And coming back to our common theme here of getting that 30 to 50 grams, how do you feel about using a protein whey powder in the morning with something that's a little bit less in protein to get to that number versus somebody that's just having like a piece of steak? Like, how does, obviously the steak's going to be more satiating, but from an MPS standpoint, having protein powder with a meal that's a little bit less in protein to still hit that threshold
I think it's a
versus
great
a
idea.
steak, how does that compare?
Whey protein actually can get away with less because the leucine content is so high. It's a great question. And a lot of the times we use shakes around here. We use whey protein shakes. In fact, don't tell my son who's 2, that's what he gets in the evenings instead of milk, because we're trying to cut back on his milk, right? Because it can bind to iron. But a shake has, so a whey protein shake in particular has the highest percentage of leucine. And again, that's really what you're going for. For example, in 1 scoop of whey protein, you might get, I don't know, 1.8 to almost 2 grams of leucine in 18 grams of dietary protein. So that's great.
And how do you feel about, obviously there's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, but using a whey protein versus some of the other plant-based proteins, whether it be a rice protein, you mentioned pea protein, you have all these, and say you have all these in your pantry, how do you look at one versus the other?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've thought about it so much, but if I were to pick one, my first one would be a rice, what would it be? Maybe a rice pea blend. I'm not excited about pea protein alone. There's other compounds in there, whether it's, I think that there's a lot of compounds that we don't know. Again, it's almost, think about it this way, the metabolomics. So there's metabolomics, there's intermediate nutrients that we don't, I think, necessarily know what they do in high concentrations, because pea protein isolate doesn't exist in nature. It's whereas whey protein, could whey be the top of, cheese or wherever you get it? It's still something that we've developed and been able to use over time, and we know that it has immunoglobulins in it, like alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin. If I were to pick, I would probably do something like a rice blend. Again, pea it doesn't have estrogen in it, but it has other molecules, estrogen-like potentially molecules that have some kind of activity. I just don't think we know over time, if someone is just consuming a high amount of pea protein, what that's going to be like.
And how do you compare a protein powder that's a whole food, whether it be plant or animal, versus a branched chain amino acid supplement?
Branched chain amino acid supplements only have the branched chains, and that would be like starting a car without putting gas in the car.
Okay, so you're not a fan of those at all?
If you are eating a lower protein meal, if you're a vegetarian and you're eating a lower protein meal, you could use either a branched chain or an essential amino acid mix.
But it sounds like the hierarchy would be like having a steak, having whey protein, maybe some of the plant-based proteins underneath, and then the branched chain amino acids at the bottom.
Yes.
Let's
it.
Move on.
I like the way you're thinking.
Let's move on to some of the other meals. We went deep into this breakfast piece and the protein bolus.
There's also something else I want to say about breakfast is, if you're going to be designing, and I'm not anti-carbohydrate, right? People, I eat a lot of carbs myself, actually, quite frankly. That the first meal and pretty much every meal outside of exercise, I don't really recommend above 40, maybe 50 grams of dietary carbohydrates because of the glucose disposal. And I talk about that in the book. You do want to keep insulin in check.
And the other piece to this too, I'll add, as you say that, and we've talked about this, but we haven't nailed on the specific, that protein, looking at it like, a dietitian may, where it's a certain percentage of the diet, you don't do it that way. You look at it again, body weight in pounds to grams. And if we're taking in less calories, coming back to cutting back calories like we talked about earlier, you still have the same amount of protein, and you just lower the fat and the carbohydrates to lower those calories.
Exactly. So protein, dietary protein is the most important macronutrient. It is essential. It is literally what we are made of. Carbohydrates we don't need. We can make it. Fat, what the essential fatty acid need is so little. But dietary protein is irreplaceable. We need to keep up with daily protein turnover, which is anywhere from 250 upwards of 300 some grams of protein that we are turning over every day. From enzymes to body parts to everything and anything that you could think of. If we don't, eat enough, you're never going to eat enough dietary protein to offset that typically. But again, this becomes the pinnacle. This is necessary. Dietary protein is necessary to support over time these processes.
Say somebody tuning in right now is hearing about the importance of protein and this is new to them and they're excited and they're going to go take out their bag of whey protein and start supplementing with a diet that's already high in protein. What I'm getting at here is
Ooh,
there
good.
too
This is a
much?
good one.
Say
Yeah.
we do get that up to like 200 grams a day or 300.
Yeah.
How does the body respond?
So we've never seen evidence that something would indicate that we have a diet too high in protein. There was some initial thoughts that maybe because of the disposal of urea, the breakdown of urea and ammonia and etc., would be kind of this upper threshold, but we haven't seen it. I haven't seen that in the literature. We have not seen what a very high protein diet over time will do. And I've seen some data, Jose Antonio's published papers. Again, they're short term papers, 8 weeks or so, of 3.5 grams per kg of protein per body weight. Yeah, we don't see really any negative benefits or any negative effects.
And what about symptom wise? Somebody that's been having a low protein diet, they come across your book now or your information or work with you, and then they really up the protein to the level we're talking about here. Do they typically notice a difference in how they feel after a day or a few
Oh, yeah.
days? And if so,
Yeah.
okay, they do. So what is that?
Yeah. I mean, one of the great things about, at least from my clinical experience, is that when you get protein right and you increase high quality proteins, you begin to balance blood sugar because you're not dependent on, a whole bunch of carbohydrates and fats. You seem to just have a steady level of energy and you're able to regulate blood sugar over time. And of course, there's this increase in satiation and you begin to just, I don't know if it's be more sturdy. That's like such a abstract way of thinking about it, but you're getting a lot of nutrients. So whether someone is iron deficient or zinc deficient, it's again not just about the dietary protein, but when you support and build a diet around protein, there's a lot of metabolic benefits. Because again, while we're eating for protein, there are other metabolic outcomes.
Let's move into the other meals now, starting with dinner, because the way I understood it from your book is that the most important is breakfast, again, hitting on that threshold.
Mhm.
But then, second in line, we'll call it, is dinner and making sure we're getting a bolus at that time too. So, talk
Mhm.
about why that's important.
It's important in the context of if you really got the first meal right, because the large steak dinner has been around forever. And so most individuals will eat lower protein in the first meal, the second meal, and then have a large steak dinner. That is not what we're talking about. This is assuming that you've nailed protein in the first meal, that the next meal after going into an overnight fast is really important. Because number one, you're going into an overnight fast, and this is your opportunity to now protect skeletal muscle as you sleep. And so having that in a robust amount is very reasonable.
Last time we talked, you said you were going through a period of time where you're reevaluating intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
How do you think about that now and what are you doing?
I now recommend everybody eat earlier. So before I used to tell people to push their meals back. I don't recommend that. I think there is something to this circadian biology and beginning your meals earlier and ending them earlier.
Okay, how do you feel about obviously as we're narrowing that eating window, we're going to have a longer period of time where insulin's going to remain low. So
Hmm.
for somebody right now who's coming to this not metabolically healthy, can fasting at least in the short term as they're gaining their metabolic health back and having that more narrow eating window, can you see value in that case?
Yeah, I mean, intermittent fasting is a potential strategy for calorie restriction. I do think that, again, restricting calories and also if they have any kind of GI issues, there is a positive to doing intermittent fasting. But if you're going to do it, don't push the feeding window back. Push it forward. Eat within an hour to 2 hours upon waking.
Okay, let's get into this a little bit more because this is an area that Don and I actually disagreed on within our conversation. I was saying that there would be benefit to keeping insulin down for longer, having that tighter eating window. And again, I don't want to butcher his words, but I believe the way he was saying it, it was just a calorie thing. And it sounds like you might be in Don's camp, but for me, there's more to it with the insulin piece and having that period of time, say it's 6 hours where you're not eating, or 6 hours where you're eating, your insulin's going to be at bay for longer. And I can at least see for somebody who isn't metabolically healthy, which in our current society, there's so many people that are in that boat, how as they're gaining their metabolic health back, that could be just so powerful during that phase and potentially beyond.
Yeah. I think that, I do believe that calories are really important. And in terms of the insulin restriction of the intermittent fasting versus feeding, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah,
Am I
the insulin
understanding
piece,
that?
like if somebody's insulin resistant and their blood glucose has just been awry and they've been eating within basically the whole time they're up and not negating anything we've talked about to this point, but adding in the fact that that eating window is tight and we're keeping insulin at bay for longer in the morning or at night, I see that being as beneficial. Don didn't see that. He didn't see it the same way as me. I'm just curious how you feel.
I would say that it's probably somewhere where both parties are right. So, kind of what I'm hearing you say is there's the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, is what I'm hearing you say,
Exactly
I
what I'm
think.
getting at.
Yeah, that there's the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that's like the insulin is driving obesity, versus is it the calorie? It's probably a combination of both. So it's probably a combination of both. The calories matter and then the insulin matters.
Let's come back to something we touched on before, but I want to get into greater detail. We talked
Okay.
about MPS and one of the triggers being exercise.
Mhm.
Let's now talk about somebody wanting to time that through exercise and their eating to
Mhm.
make sure they're getting the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to MPS. So they just woke up. It's 8 in the morning. They're going to get a morning workout in. When
Mhm.
should they have that protein bolus to get the best response with exercise and protein, the synergy between the two?
Yeah, the literature would suggest it just matters in a 24-hour period, especially if you're young and healthy, that it doesn't really matter. I would say that there's evidence to support if you're older, that, again, if you're older with anabolic resistance or increase in insulin resistance, then having protein closer to after you're done training is probably more ideal because of this synergistic effect. And again, most of the data, when you look at these studies, are done very closely after training, and potentially that's where the recommendation came from. But we know that that works. So that component works. And that's where I would say if you are older or you have some kind of catabolic condition, it probably makes a little bit of a difference versus if you're young and healthy.
And when it comes to stimulus, there's such a wide range of resistance training from body weight exercises, low weight, high
Mhm.
rep, high weight, low rep, and everything in between. What's the stimulus required resistance training wise for MPS?
Well, there's a really great paper, and it's loading recommendations for muscle strength, hypertrophy, and local endurance. Probably the best paper I've read in a very long time about this kind of concept and this continuation of what we recommend, right? There's lots of recommendations. I think what we're really looking for is we're really looking for a adaptation, right? So it's not the muscle protein synthetic response per se, but it's the adaptation that we are getting. Would you say that we would kind of agree with that?
Okay. So it's
Right? So it's not
specify a bit more on that.
yeah, so what we're really looking for is it an increase in muscle strength? Is it an increase in muscle size? Is it an increase in endurance? We're really looking for some kind of physiological response,
Okay. Yes.
right? Right? So if we think about the that we're looking for a physiological response, the way typically we think about exercise, or at least it's always been kind of outlined in the literature, is that there's a strength, hypertrophy, and an endurance kind of rep range continuum. But is it true that you have to lift really heavy to get some kind of muscle response? I would say they're different. For example, there's evidence to support that a individual who is older can put on muscle with lighter weights and much more repetition, right? Way outside of the hypertrophy zone of 8 to 12, you know? And I think that it comes down to number one, that we are looking for this adaptation. And number two, there are many ways to get the adaptation. So that's how I would explain kind of that piece of it.
And for somebody who is tuning in and say they're already a little bit later in life, 50 or beyond, you hear people talk about within the resistance training world, the fact that you need to start this early and you got to build up your reserve of muscle. And it almost sounds very, it sounds very discouraging for somebody who is going to begin this later in life. So what would you say to that person who's hasn't done this to this point, but they're 50 and beyond, they want to take this on? What can they really change at that point?
Oh, yeah. You see, there's literature of individuals, 80s and older, who put on muscle and improve strength. It's never too late.
And another piece of this too, especially when it comes to older people, is osteoporosis.
Yeah.
And what goes
That's
hand in
probably
hand
a
with putting
that's
on muscle
probably
mass is you're going to put on bone density. So talk about the win-win there.
yeah. This idea, so muscle mass and bone density, the pulling, and this is where the myokines come in, is there's also an interplay and crosstalk within, an interorgan crosstalk within the bone. I would say that one of the things that we can think about is that potentially loss of skeletal muscle mass could even be a predictor for osteopenia or osteoporosis, because they are so interchangeable. In terms of interchangeable is the wrong word, that they are so connected. In order to build healthy bone, you do need force, you do need resistance, and again, that contractile action supports bone. And for healthy bone, you need dietary protein.
As a physician, how many doctors out there do you think tell their patients as they're getting older the importance of resistance training when it comes to putting on bone? Because to me, it seems like the common thing prescribed is calcium, and taking that supplement, having more passive
Yeah.
approach. So how do you feel about calcium? And then do you feel like
I
doctors are prescribing this resistance training? It's free. It's something anybody can begin at any age we've talked about.
They will more and more. I think in a geriatric population, they're going to more and more. I think that it will happen. I can tell you the percentage of physicians that are talking about it, but I think more and more will be.
And coming back to the calcium piece, you mentioned the fact that
Yes,
protein's an important part of building bone, but are you a fan of taking calcium as a supplement?
I am, especially for women. Yeah, I am. Later on, when the hormonal milieu changes, yes, that is a current recommendation.
And the other supplement I think you talked about before was creatine. Any other supplements in this realm when it comes to putting on bone and
Yes, there's a
muscle?
new one. There's a new one
What's that?
called Urolithin A, Mitopure. Mitopure is a company,
Oh,
and Urolithin
you
A.
did talk about this one last time, but expand
Oh,
on it.
it's did I
You
really?
did.
It's amazing. It's helps with mitophagy, which is the cleaning out of old mitochondria. But this company did it really right. They looked at the evidence and they generated over a decade of literature and really, really made sure that this stuff worked before they even brought it to market. So it helps with strength, it helps with endurance, it helps with energy, all because it helps with muscle health. I think it's going to be the frontier of the gut muscle axis.
Let's talk more about gut health. As you mentioned, gut, it gets me thinking
Sure.
about the microbiome. And we've talked a
Mhm.
lot about protein, and protein, when it comes to animal sources, isn't a source of fiber for the microbiome. But you've talked about the fact that you're not anti-plant, you're an omnivore.
Mhm.
How do you feel about getting fiber through plants and the importance of that when it comes to maintaining a healthy microbiome?
I think it's important. I think that there's good evidence to support that the body needs fiber, and we need prebiotic, postbiotics. Um, Gut health is huge. We do a lot of gut health in my clinic. So I have an active clinic. We still see patients. Fiber is really important, and again, these prebiotics, um, all critical.
You talk about the carnivore diet. We got to go there if you're talking about
Sure.
fiber. And you do have a little blurb in your book saying that this could be a useful tool, I believe short term in a certain case.
hmm
So can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, I have found that when individuals do, it's a carnivore reset, which is it's like a full elimination diet. That again, it's just a great reset, and we've used it in clinic. I don't recommend. Again, it's so individual for people. If you want to, it's totally up to them, whatever they want to do. But in clinical practice, for me, we use a carnivore reset if someone is having really bad GI issues, and it seems to be very helpful over time.
And any reason you're not a proponent of that long term? Is it the microbiome piece?
Well, I mean, I think that there are some people that will do fine on it long term. It just depends on the microbiome. I really think that it is so individualistic. It is so individual.
Let's talk about biggest mistakes you see when people are going about resistance training and it's new to them. They're taking this on.
The biggest thing is not working hard enough and not really having this mind muscle connection and really being focused and thinking about what they're doing and quitting too early. The first adaptations are usually somewhat neuromuscular before you see gains in strength or size. So don't let the quit in. As my friend Lisa Jaster says, don't let the quit in.
We'll talk more about the timeline piece. How long does it take before we start to see all the different physiological changes when
Yeah,
somebody
it
is new
depends
to
on the
this?
person. Well, someone who is doing resistance training or endurance type exercises, you'll see an improvement in insulin sensitivity and skeletal muscle almost immediately. You'll see a short term improvement in HDL and triglycerides and LDL. But again, you have to do these things consistently. But that's pretty immediate. It's it's not maintained. You have to continue to train. Um, from a size perspective, when you're first starting a program, again, there's this kind of neuromuscular adaptation. But once you begin to put on tissue, there's so many, it's very complex as to who does it. Are they a hard gainer or really good? Again, there's total genetic variability. But, if someone's young, they could definitely put on a pound to 2 pounds of muscle in a month, especially if they're untrained. Again, it really just depends. But the first adaptations are neuromuscular.
And how do you feel about cardio in this whole piece?
I think it's great, but it
Specifically
cannot replace.
to
It cannot replace.
MPS, is there any relationship between the two? And then in general?
No. Yeah, I think that when I think about cardiovascular activity, I think about mitochondrial health. I think about volume. Um, I think about volume and its effect on mitochondrial content, but I don't think about it as it relates to hypertrophy. But it is good for cardiovascular activity and heart health and blood flow.
And this ties into something I really like from the book, the fact that you like to allocate carbs depending on activity level. And this isn't totally
Mhm,
directed at cardio, but I really like this way of thinking about it. For somebody that's going to include, say, 60 more grams of carbs in a day,
mhm,
time that with a day when you're going to be training and look at that as
mhm.
fuel
Yep,
for that workout.
I think that's a great strategy because the last thing you want to do is uh, eat a huge carbohydrate meal and it not be for any purpose. Like, what's the metabolic purpose except to kind of stress out your insulin? I just don't think it's ideal. You have to be training. You have to earn your carbs.
And when it comes to the training piece and the dietary piece, how do you look at that when it comes to men versus women?
I don't. I've been looking at the literature a lot. I think we still need more work to be done. Um, Obviously, there are clearly differences, and we are going to see literature come out. But as of right now, I haven't seen the literature yet. But I know it's coming out because I know my friends are doing it. They just haven't published some of the data, and I think that you're going to see that there's a difference in protein amounts. But as of right now, again, I would say not. And then training. I think there's a lot of discussion on female training syncing with their cycle. I can't say that that's effective, at least from what I've seen. But I don't train professional athletes. I don't know the input or influence that would have on an everyday person.
Throughout our conversation, we've given a lot of detail, a lot of nuance for people that really want to get into the weeds with this. But for the average person who is, busy right now, they have a family, they have kids, and they have a job, and they want to get the maximum benefit for putting in the minimum dose or a lower dose of what we talked about. So what I'm getting at here is, how do they get the
Great question.
biggest bang for their buck when it comes to resistance training
You
and
don't have to do
dietary
much.
protein with
Yeah,
everything we've
yeah.
talked about?
Well, first of all, they have to read my book because I make it very, very, very simple and straightforward. And there's evidence to support you could easily train 2 days a week and still get benefit. I mean, that is the minimum effective dose, 2 days a week of resistance training. You might throw in some short intervals in there, but it doesn't take much to stimulate muscle and to maintain muscle health. It actually doesn't take much. And dietary protein, again, to create a diet is not difficult. It's just requires consistency from a very high level. Figure out how much protein you need, dose it appropriately. Don't go crazy. It doesn't have to be 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. It can be less, but just definitely nail that low hanging fruit.
And for somebody who doesn't have any weights at home and they're going to take this on starting today and want to use body weight and just start with a very simple program, can you give them 3 to 5 exercises they can do to get
Yeah,
started?
I actually have I did an entire exercise library. Did you know that? Did you see it?
Where can we find that?
My website. My website.
Okay, well, we'll link that up, but can you take us
Yep.
through a bit of what that looks
Yeah.
like?
Squats are a great exercise. Squats. So I do this all the time. We do squats, we do push-ups and lunges. Those would be my top 3. Walking lunges. So squats, walking lunges, and push-ups.
And how do you feel about walking as a form of cardio to add into that mix?
I think walking should be a part of your life. I think we should really kind of up the ante.
So do you have a certain amount of steps per day you like to aim for, walking after meals to help regulate blood glucose?
I do.
How do you incorporate that?
I walk 10,000 steps a day. I probably should walk double that. I think it's a little bit of an arbitrary number. Definitely walking after a meal, I think is great. It's a great way to leverage skeletal muscle to lower blood sugar, quite simply. But it's not exercise or resistance training. Resistance training is your non-negotiable.
Talk more about that, because
It's just your
oftentimes
non-negotiable.
people within their health and wellness routine, I feel like they don't consider that as a non-negotiable, and how the mindset piece of putting that in as something you're gonna do is so essential.
You're never going to feel, let me say this, that capacity is cultivated, and it's not cultivated through comfort. The mindset piece is the most important piece, because I can give you the perfect program, but unless you feel worthy of obtaining it, unless you feel that you have the tools to become that kind of person, you will always sabotage yourself.
Well, let's talk about what doing that work is, because you do make it very apparent when you read your book. You have a mindset piece at the end of each chapter, And you say that the mind is the most important muscle to work on. So for
It is.
somebody to kick off, to make sure they can fully embrace everything we're saying today, how do they incorporate that mindset piece to get that rolling?
Yeah. The first thing I would do is I mean, there's a series of things, which is why I put a whole bunch in my book. The first step, I would say, well, there's many first steps, so you can pick which one you're going to do, but really think about who the person is that you want to become and do the actions match with what you are doing. So who do you want to become? And if you want to become someone strong and fit, then take those actions. And that would be the first thing. So everything has to answer to an action. The next thing I would think is, do you feel worthy? What's your worthiness temperature? I see a lot of people are influenced by old trauma that really crushes their capacity. And so instead of really working towards their health and wellness, they're running from an old trauma that's been unidentified. And if you do not identify and face the old traumas, you will constantly be running from them. And I know that might seem separate from health and wellness, but it sure, again, I've been a practicing physician for over a decade. It's not separate. It's just not. You have to do the work. You have to figure it out. And oftentimes, there doesn't have to be a narrative around it. It just has to be addressed. It doesn't have to have a huge narrative. And then the other thing I would say is really identifying your weaknesses. People right now always focus on strengths. Your strengths don't matter. You're not falling short of becoming the person you want to become because of your strengths. You're falling short because of your weaknesses. And you have to know your weaknesses because then you can plan for them. You can't account for things that you aren't aware of. And then the human dynamic is amazing because then it's shocked every time. Shocked when you don't get the results, and shocked because they're reaching for another cookie when you know that every time you're stressed, you reach for a cookie. So you plan for that.
Gabrielle, up until this point, we've talked a lot about what to do when it comes to resistance training, having enough protein, dietary changes, getting the mindset right. I want to flip things now and talk about things from a recovery standpoint. So let's start talking about the importance of sleep and then other modalities we can use for recovery.
Yeah. So sleep, one night of sleep restriction can decrease muscle protein synthetic response by 18%. Sleep is really important. I don't get enough of it, so I can't tell people to do something that I don't do, but I'm trying. Sleep is very important. It's also the time that the brain cleans itself, the glial cells get rid of metabolic waste. It's really important. And I think that people always talk about it. It's also important from a metabolism point of view. Helps with blood sugar regulation, helps with insulin response. Again, untreated sleep apnea is a risk factor for what I believe as obesity. And you got to get into sleep. From a recovery aspect, the other things are, you choose it. You could choose whether it's massage, whether it's an ice bath, whether it's sauna, whatever it is that you like, you choose.
And how do you look at recovery specifically from resistance training? Somebody that's gone into the gym, they've pushed it, they're feeling a little bit sore in a good way. How do they know how long to take in between workouts and give their body that rest they need to rebuild and repair?
Yeah, I think most people are not training hard enough that it becomes a major issue. But again, listening to your body is really helpful, and it's listening to your body, but also sticking to a plan. For example, I've been traveling a lot with this book. I was exhausted today. I still got up at 4, got myself up, hung out with my husband, got my kids. I took my kids to the gym. I trained at 7. And I walked in, I'm like, oh God, I work with a trainer. I work out at a place called Sigma here in Houston. Shout out to Carlos. And I was like, Carlos, I don't want to work that hard. He's like, yeah, right. We're doing it. And I worked hard, but I worked safe and I felt great. But I could have easily talked myself out of it. Oh, I need another recovery day. No, I need to be training. And also, intensive training can offset lack of sleep. But yes, recovery is important. Yes, you should listen to your body, but you should also have a program that you stick to. I don't know. People do all this other stuff like heart rate variability. I don't look at that stuff. I think it's important to limit a little technology. The best hack is hard work, my friend, not less work.
One thing I want to highlight there, the fact that you are somebody who's a scientist in this area, understands the physiology of muscle and diet, and you still have a trainer that you work with. So talk about why that is. Is that just for the motivation on days when you're going to skip the gym, or what is it that you get from that as somebody who does understand all these nuances?
Yeah, I'm not my own doctor either. Yeah, I got to outsource that. No, definitely not. I'm also not a fitness professional.
But you know the ins and outs. I mean, you know what you need to do in the gym, and you know what you need to do for recovery and to fuel your body properly. But yet you're still paying for that and subscribing to that service. And that the reason I want to highlight that is because, again, if you're somebody who's doing that, there must be a lot of value in that.
Yep, there is. I always work with a trainer, always work with a coach.
The last thing I want to end on here is kids. And at what age, we talked about from a dietary piece, how because of the hormones, the MPS isn't important when kids are really young, and it becomes more important around 30. But from a training perspective, as somebody with young kids, at what age can you start to have them do resistance training?
Right now, my 2-year-old does it.
Okay. And at what age did your 2-year-old start?
Just recently. They just get interested. Yeah.
And is that just to form the habit, or is there certain benefits that a 2-year-old's going to get from doing that?
I mean, I haven't seen 2-year-olds studied, but there is the skeletal muscle cells that you have, the time to really prime them is when they're young. You know, the health of this tissue is really important. Movement and capacity is really important. And they get into the habit. I mean, can you imagine? I have a few different businesses. I run a practice. I have 2 very little children and a husband who works as a surgical resident, right? And I am still bringing my children to the gym. They should still be exposed to that stuff. We are upstairs, you know, we do push-ups. I only see the upside of this.
It's interesting because I feel like classically, the way it's been portrayed and passed down is that kids up until at least their teens, and maybe even arguably beyond that, should be not involving themselves in resistance training, and there could be some damage done to the body if they get into it too early.
Yeah. That's all fake. How about that? It's fake. I mean, it's not like my kid is doing deadlifts, but if you look at my Instagram stories, I mean, my kids are working out and they're strong. They're strong and they're capable and they should be doing it. And it should be fun for them. And in my book, I think I put some of, I mean, I know I put, I don't know if it's the American Pediatric Society, but talked about the recommendations. Get your kids training young, get them strong. And it's never too late. It's never too late.
Gabrielle, I think what's going to bring a lot of people to this conversation is going to be the weight loss piece. That's what brings a lot of people, I'm sure, to a lot of my conversations, because that's such a ongoing challenge for a lot of people in the modern world. So as we wrap up here, we've talked about the MPS and getting the protein. That's definitely a big piece of this. Resistance training. What other pieces, the recovery, but what other pieces can we add to that for somebody who right now is struggling to lose weight? And coming back to how we opened up, somebody that's tried different diets and playing with macros and they're just not getting it. And they feel like they've really even tried some of the stuff we're talking about today. What's some other nuance and different things they can add into what I just said?
So you're not going to like this answer. Oh, well, I'm putting words into your mouth. But the treatment should match the severity of the challenge. So if an individual has tried everything and is really suffering, then that may be the time to implement medication to whether it's improve metabolism or improve insulin sensitivity. I am not one of those physicians who does not believe in using pharmaceuticals when necessary. So if you have done everything right and you are still not moving the needle and are unhappy and it is affecting your mental health and your family and the way that you show up in the world, then that is when you would consider moving to something stronger. And there's no shame in that.
Okay, fair enough. But do you feel like there are people genetically or due to certain health complications that just can't put the pieces together like we talked about and get there naturally? Is this what I'm getting at here? Is this a substitute for what we're talking about, or are there really people out there who do everything we're saying and just can't get to their goal weight?
I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but again, I've been a physician in practice for a very long time. And sometimes people do everything right, and whether they have other challenges in their life that for some reason it's not working, I have seen it have a tremendous impact, and then you take them off the medication and they're able to maintain it. So I think we have to be open-minded about things and use the modalities and the tools that we have.
All right, Gabrielle, we'll end on that. I was telling you before we hit record, I love the book.
Oh,
This is
I'm
going to
so
help a
glad.
lot of people. You take the science and you just break it down in a way that we can all understand, and you have the clinical experience, and our conversations have been wonderful. There's so much in these, and the book, again, is fantastic.
Thank
So I
you
just
so
want to
much.
thank you for everything. We're going to link up your website, the
Thank
book, your
you.
social media, everything in the show notes. And I want to thank you for coming back on again.
Thanks, Jesse. I really appreciate it.
Now that you're done my conversation with Gabrielle, you're going to want to head over here and catch my chat with Don. Don is Gabrielle's mentor, and he knows a ton about protein. I'll see you over there.
What you want is a good foundation when you get to midlife, because it's pretty easy to develop muscle into your